tell you what's going on here. Every day I get up, get in this car, grab a cup of coffee, and go to work. And the reason I'm talking to you in this car today is because I know that once I enter those doors at the shop, all hell's gonna break loose. I'm getting pulled in a million different directions between phone calls, parts orders, parts problems, you name it. And for the past 6 months, I've been building nothing but Muncie 4-speeds and Jaguar 5-speeds. So I put a poll up on Facebook asking people what they would like to see in my videos. And the most common response that most people asked was, how can I make my transmission shift better? A lot of them were related to the Tremec TKO 500, 600 series transmission, as well as the Richmond 4+1, 5-speed, and 6-speed series. Now, both of these transmissions have very heavy gear trains in them, utilizing old technology as far as synchronizer rings go. So both of them suffer from the same engineering problem. Old technology that was never designed to be used with heavy gears. So I'm really excited because I had this guy send in his Richmond 4+1 5-speed. And I haven't seen one of these in about 8 years, I think. So this would be really cool to do a video on how I can make this transmission shift better. These simple principles in this video can be applied to other gearboxes as well. So let's see what goes on when I get to the shop, and hopefully you'll like it. Heavy transmissions. I need a new back. So your Richmond Gear Street 5-speed, this is the old Doug Nash 4+1, where fourth gear is still a underdrive and then fifth gear is direct. This is your first and second lever, your 3/4 lever, and your fifth and reverse lever. It's a split case transmission. It splits in half, and you can see there's these notches over here where you would put a pry tool, both front and back, to pry the case halves apart. The transmission has a front bearing retainer held on with 4 bolts here. These are 1/2-inch head nuts that are on here, I guess, and there's studs that are kind of in the case. In the back side over here, you have 4 5/8 head nuts that again are on studs that are in the case halves. So to take this transmission apart, you either take the tail off first, go back, and then take the front bearing retainer off. Then if you flip it around, bolts again over here, and these here are 9/16 heads. There's 4 of them, followed by 6/4, I think now there's about 5/4 inch hex head cap screws down here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then 1 3/8 cap screw down in the middle in the center over here. So the procedure again is we're going to take front retainer off, extension housing off, case half bolts off, then pry the case apart. So really all you need to do to get this job going is a couple of tools. A couple of socket heads, 1/4 inch, 3/8, 5/8, 9/16, and 1/2 inch. And that comes right off. Now, by the way, this is a actual T10 front bearing retainer gasket, but it appears a little thicker than the normal gaskets, so you may want to just to keep this around, don't throw it out, so you can mic it up later and measure it, and use the corresponding gasket to set the thickness again on it. Also, these seals are weird. They're not the standard Super T10 size seal in a lot of them. This retainer seal, the OD is the same, but the ID is a little bit different, so you may want to watch that too. Don't be quick to toss this seal out because this sometimes is a very hard seal to find.
So you got these 4 5/8 hex head the nuts off, and it looks like again they have some very thin washers over here. I don't want to lose them, so I'm going to try to pry them out. Looks like one of them was actually missing. But what you could do is you could pry this off a little bit. I have a special chisel that I kind of sharpen extra sharp to use to pry against cases like this, to try to get in areas. Once you kind of crack it loose, because it's just held on with sealer, then you can pull the extension housing off like this. You can see the split, the way it runs in the case, right down the center. It's always good to have some lumber in the shop. Right, so what I'm going to do now is raise the transmission with this lumber so it's not laying on the shift levers. Like I said, I want to keep the shift levers pointing down. That looks good. So you can see the way I got the lumber set up. Back one, front one, and I'm allowing the 3 shifter shafts to clear the bench so they're floating over here. Now what will happen is that when I split this transmission case in half and the upper part will come off, the lower part will keep the gear train intact and keep all the shift forks engaged with the sliders and everything, so I can see how everything is working. And I can make my adjustments as needed. So get my 4 9/16 headed nuts off. There's washers in it. These are really rusty, this hardware. So I suggest that when you put it back together, you may want to put something called Cosmoline or a rust preventative on these studs and bolts. Clean them up a bit. Three on the top. Got the 2 on the bottom. This is a 3/8 one over here. Sometimes these can be really tight because they might have thread locker on them or silicone sealer. Now there's 4 pry tabs on each side of the case. 2 in the front, 2 in the bottom. Because you have studs, 2 in the front and 2 in the back, this case half has to come straight up. You really can't move it around too much this way. There's not enough leeway to do that. Look at this. This was built in a day where they were really into silicone sealer, and it's horrible. It really is. What I'm doing is I'm prying against the bearings in the case to try to get this thing loose. Here we go. So look at this beautiful thing apart now. You got first gear, second gear, third gear, fourth gear, and your main drive. These are your reverse gears over here. Notice the mass of this assembly as well. And if you look at the synchronizer rings, they're the same type of rings that are used in a early T10. So you could see that we have all this mass and we're using the same rings. Now a lot of times it's the rings themselves. They really don't grab the gears well. You know? And so we're going to put some better rings in here. Reduce some of this slop. Notice that these rings here are almost against the gears all the way here. Now that could be the cut of the gear. It could be the ring itself. But we're going to put some better rings that hopefully will grab the gears better. That's our first step. And the next step is to work on the interlock system internally to get it to shift better as well. And also these forks and the sliders, you see how sloppy they are? There's really not much you can do about that, but we'll do our best to kind of tighten these things up here and get the system working and shifting much better than it is from the factory. Shift forks that are on cams are typical in the Richmond 5-speeds, 6-speeds, T10s, Super T10s, Muncies, and Saginaws, and Chrysler AA33s. The only transmissions that have shift forks that operate on rails are the Ford top loader and all the later model transmissions, such as the Tremec TKOs, T5s, and T56s. Other than that, all shift forks are running on cams. Now, I don't know if you can see this, but when I shift it, watch the way the fork moves. If you notice, it has more air on the top between the groove and the fork here, and less on the bottom. But as we shift it, the fork moves because it's moving in an arc. It's kind of centralized more in this position. So it's up and then it's down again when it goes into the third gear position like this. So if you watch the fork again, it kind of rises and then drops down when it's in fourth gear. Same thing when it's in third gear, it drops down again. And this position where it's dropping down is when the shift fork ideally is centered within the groove of the slider. And that's kind of critical to know, because sometimes if your forks are too tight this way, if they're in too much like this, you can actually bind. It's called throat binding. And what will happen is the unit will not shift that good. I particularly do not like shift forks that have just raised edges, because the fork has got to travel, and I would rather have a flat edge so it stays perpendicular to the slider at all times. Okay, so what we simply do now is we're going to just lift this whole gear train out. So it's all free, and so you got the two bearings that are in the case, rear bearing and front bearing. Usually what I do is I put my thumbs here like this, and I kind of pry out. Okay? This exposes the whole shifter mechanism. So you could see the 1-2 fork, 3-4 fork, and fifth and reverse fork. So you could see the movement. That's what's kind of neat about these transmissions. You can actually see how they work. We want to make sure that these interlock systems are working properly and not binding. In this particular setup, it looks good, but we'll get to that later. First step is you remove the input shaft. It just slides out. There's a pilot needle underneath it that you pull out. There's a synchronizer ring. Keep it with the input shaft. No need to take off the front bearing because we're not dealing with that right now. We're just going to work on the synchronizers. The fifth reverse slider will come out, and you got to be careful because the 3 keys and springs will come flying out with it. Inside here is a snap ring that we have to remove to get the fifth and reverse synchronizer hub off. The fifth reverse hub will just slide off. This is kind of a unique design. This is a split thrust washer. It comes out, and it's actually encapsulated by the hub like this when it's inside, so it can't come apart. You see? So once you take that out, the fourth gear will slide right out with the fourth gear ring, fourth gear needle roller. Be careful that these rollers don't fall apart, that they don't come out, because they can be loose in the cages and you could lose them. Next, we're going to have to deal with this snap ring over here. These are pretty thick snap ring that holds the 3-4 hub for the synchronizer in place. It's right over here. Right, before I get into removing the snap ring, just want to give you a quick lesson on snap ring pliers. There's all sorts of different pliers. These are called retaining ring pliers that have these flat edges on them. Several different types available. You can usually find them on eBay. We are going to be selling them on my website soon. This is a parallel plier that keeps the two areas that are in contact with the spring parallel so they don't kind of move out on an arc against the ring. But different pliers have different reaches. Like if you look at this plier, okay, compared to this plier opens up more. So sometimes you need a combination of several pliers to get difficult snap rings off. So what happens is I may start with this plier here and get it started. But you see, I can't get it over the edge. It doesn't have enough reach, okay? So maybe these parallel pliers will get it moving better. Okay, that doesn't work. Now let's try these that have a bigger reach. A little bit more effort to get it going. See, I got it started now, and I can bring it up. Now this looks like it's kind of tight, so it's going to have to be put on the press, so we'll do that. But in the meantime, let's take off the speedometer gear and get the plastic gear out of the way. So here's your speedometer gear. It's an 8-tooth blue speedometer gear. You've got a forward snap ring and a rear snap ring that hold it in place. I want to remove this because I don't want it to get damaged. It's plastic while I'm pressing off stuff on the press. Let's get this one out. These gears usually slide right off, you see? Now we'll take this one out too. And while we're at it, we'll remove the snap ring that holds the rear bearing to the main shaft. This hub is a little bit of a tight press fit on the 3/4 synchronizer hub. So what I'm going to do is just take the slider off, let the keys and springs pop off. The 3 keys out of here. And this way, a little bit less weight to work with on the press. So the plan here is I'm going to put the press clamps underneath the 3rd speed gear, press the 3/4 synchronizer hub off with the gear, remove the needle bearing, put the press clamps underneath 1st speed gear, remove the 1st speed gear, the thrust washer. There's I believe a thrust washer back here, and the rear bearing. Take the snap ring off underneath the 1-2 hub that holds that in place, and then take that assembly off, and then the main shaft will be completely disassembled. Okay, so I made this crazy contraption because this 1st speed gear is so wide it won't fit through the throat of the press. So I took the press blocks and I inverted them, like this, and then put the press clamps like this. So the idea is now I'm gonna have the press clamp support the 3rd speed gear and press through it like this. Okay, so here we go. This isn't a hard press, but I don't like hitting shafts if I don't have to. And this thing is kind of heavy. That's the hub and the 3rd speed gear. We'll get rid of these clamps and get the rest of the stuff out of the way for now. The 3rd gear needle bearing setup has 2 bearings and a spacer, so be careful not to lose, again, the needles or the spacer. You have a flange that's part of the main shaft, so no other gears can come off this way. They all have to go that way. And that means we're going to be pressing from 2nd gear all the way through. But usually on presses like this, because we have a bearing, I'll press against 1st gear, take the bearing off, and then press the hub off in 2nd gear. Okay, so the press clamps are underneath the 1st speed gear. I removed the snap ring from the rear bearing. Got my little spacer here. I should be able to press everything right through. And I'm supporting the shaft with my hand on the bottom so it doesn't fall out. It appears to be a little bit of a fairly tight fit, okay? But it's coming out with no issue. Now, from what I remember, there used to be a thrust washer behind this gear. which there is, you see. Okay, so you got your rear bearing, the thrust washer for first speed gear. Put that aside. And you got the first speed gear. Look at the size of this gear. Look how big it is. Notice the way they bevel out the inside of the gear here to save weight, to save rotating mass. This gear is like a truck gear. It's huge. All right, so what we got here is we got the two bearings, the double bearings for first speed gear. And there's a snap ring over here, so we have to remove the snap ring as well. I'm going to go take it back on the bench and take the snap ring off, which will take the 1-2 synchronizer off, and then we'll may have to press this whole second gear off as well. This is the first gear synchronizer ring. Going to put that with the first gear over here. These are the first gear bearings. There's two of them. The last step in taking apart the main shaft is taking off the 1-2 synchronizer hub assembly. And again, it's got one of those really big snap rings on it, so I'm using the pliers with the big reach on this. And here we go. And this isn't tight at all, so it comes right off. So I take off the 1-2 synchronizer, second gear ring, and second gear. And again, be very careful of the needle bearings, the spacer, and the other needle bearing that goes underneath the gear. So here's a nice disassembly shot of the whole main shaft and the bearings. And notice how I bag the bearings so they don't get dusty. It's one thing I do on all my builds. If I'm taking something apart and I may use the bearings over again, I'll always bag them. So you got your first gear, second gear, third gear, fourth gear, and your main drive, which is fifth when it's direct. Fifth reverse synchro, 3/4 synchro, and the 1-2 synchro, and the rear bearing. The cluster gear in this transmission pulls straight out. You can grab it like this and pull it out like this. You know, it's not a big deal. However you want to grab it, just pull it out. This plug is glued in the front. It's pilled in with silicone sealer. So when you put it back together, you want to make sure that you just glue it back together. So I'm going to pull it out anyway, and then we'll glue it back. This is an early T10 first speed gear. It weighs 3 pounds, 0.3 ounces. This is your Doug Nash 4+1 first speed gear. Look at that, it weighs 4 pounds, 4 ounces. So to get an idea of the difference in weight, it's about 1 pound, 4 ounces. So weight plays a big part in how a transmission ships, the rotating mass. So here we have a Super T10 cluster gear, 264 ratio actually. Weighs in at 8 pounds, we're at 7.8 pounds, that gear. So this is the counter gear of the Richmond 4+1 5-speed. Look how massive it is against the Super T10 cluster. Let's go see what the weight of this is. This is weighing in at 18.4 pounds. So you can see the huge size difference between the Super T10 counter gear and the Richmond 4+1 counter gear. There's a little bit over 10-pound difference in weight alone by these two. And when you combine that with the upper gears, that whole difference in rotating mass is roughly 20 pounds, which means those synchronizer rings have to work harder to stop this gear train than this gear train. So in order for us to use the same synchronizer ring that was used on this type of setup, now we're going to use it on this, we're going to have to use synchronizer rings that actually apply faster and grab harder. And that's the problem. We found a better ring that works for these that does the job.